So everything's at stake for Socrates, and this is the dialogue that records right before Socrates' final trial, right? The apologia, defense dialogue, which is really a monologue, I guess. And shortly thereafter, Socrates is put to death, right, for impiety. So you might say, Socrates even says at one point, my life kind of hangs on this dialogue.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Plato's Euthyphro, this brief dialogue that we actually had an all-school seminar on a couple weeks ago. So the entire student body here at TAC divided into sections, and we all read the Euthyphro. So everyone on campus was reading this work by Plato. So I guess if we could give a little summary of the dialogue and then get into the actual meat of it.
Sounds good.
So this dialogue opens with Socrates, the protagonist of many of Plato's dialogues, encountering a younger man named Euthyphro in the city streets of Athens. And they're both on their way to the court. And Socrates is being charged with corrupting the youth of the city and with, in some way, undermining the city's religious beliefs.
Yeah. By introducing new gods, right?
That's
Something
right.
like that?
Yeah. And Euthyphro is on his way to the court for the opposite reason. He is the prosecutor in his case. And in fact, he's prosecuting his own father.
Right.
For a rather complicated scenario involving a kind of murder or manslaughter.
Yeah, yeah.
To where his father had a slave, which slave in a drunken fit murdered another servant. And so the father, Euthyphro's father, bound this slave, and while he sent someone else to the priest to figure out what would be the right thing to do, the slave ended up dying.
Yeah.
And
He was exposed to the elements or something like that. He was bound and left in a ditch or something like that.
Yes.
And he just died, I guess, starved or was, got cold.
Yeah, right. And so Euthyphro is bringing his father to court for murder on account of this. And Socrates is surprised that Euthyphro is doing this. And it leads to this question as to, well, is this the pious thing to do for you, Euthyphro, to bring your father to court? And Euthyphro indicates that he has great knowledge of what is pious.
Yeah, he's a priest or a soothsayer or something, professional, something.
Yeah, he seems to be known as some sort of expert in religious matters.
Right.
And so that then leads into the bulk of the dialogue, which has to do with this question, what is piety? And Euthyphro and Socrates discuss this question for the rest of the dialogue. In all, it's only about 12 pages.
Yeah, short.
And like many Socratic dialogues, it doesn't reach some sort of neat and tidy, wrapped up, settled conclusion. But it's a profoundly interesting little dialogue they have here. So that's the drama of it in a nutshell. Chris, what do you find significant or great about this work here?
Yeah, it's a wonderful little dialogue. I think in part, like as you said, it's very succinct. It's short, but it goes very quickly into the deepest things. Not just because piety, at least if you believe there's a God or gods, right, is an important thing, but or important thing to understand, but because it dives pretty quickly into determining what it is, maybe the best way to define it, and see how, and to determine based on that how it would affect your actions. What are the pious things to do or not do, right? Because not only is Euthyphro here claiming his act of prosecuting his father is an act of piety, Socrates is being accused of performing or being impious, being the opposite, right? Because he is accused, at least, of inventing new gods and thereby corrupting the youth of Athens. Right? So Socrates says, I'm really glad I ran into you, Euthyphro, right now, so that I can understand what piety is and possibly be able to see the error of my ways or see how to convince the jury in the court trial that I wasn't being impious. So everything's at stake for Socrates. And this is the dialogue that records right before Socrates' final trial, right? The apologia, defense dialogue, which is really a monologue, I guess. And shortly thereafter, Socrates is put to death, right, for impiety. So you might say, Socrates even says at one point, my life kind of hangs on this dialogue, right? So dramatically, you could see the greatness of the dialogue insofar as Plato is portraying it as at least one of the last last-ditch efforts before Socrates was put to death. But more importantly, I think it gets into the deep matter of how should we think about what piety is in relation to other virtues, or and specifically, since it obviously has something to do with the gods, how the gods are related to piety, right? A really important puzzle occurs to Socrates, and he puts it to Euthyphro around a third of the way through the dialogue, about whether certain acts or people are pious simply because the gods have declared them so, right? Or just because the gods want people to do these things. Or are the gods themselves looking at something called piety and they want people to conform themselves to that thing, right? In other words, are the gods measured by something other than themselves, or are the gods the measure of all things, right? And that seems to me that's a really important thing to think about for a person of any sort of religion. Yeah, possibly even an atheist, I suppose, right?
Yeah, that it brings to mind for me, with our students here in their freshman year. Well, they read Plato, but they also read the entire Bible.
Yeah,
And so you
right.
get a story early on, like the story of Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah,
The
right.
Lord, the God, is asking Abraham to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
And while the majority of students here are believing Christians,
Yeah.
it can be a real question for them. Precisely the sort of thing you were just talking about. Is this God, uh, in asking Abraham to sacrifice his own son, is he just sort of his own volition, capriciously determining what the pious thing to do is?
Yeah.
Especially in a case that seems to run so counter to our natural
Yeah.
thought.
To everything.
Yeah,
Almost, yeah. Yeah. Is it something that God has simply picked out of at random, like Abraham, hop on one leg, or something like that? Just do what I want. That's the pious thing to do now, is hop on one leg, right? Now, slay your son, right?
yeah.
Right? Is it something like that? Because God doesn't explain himself, right? At least not in terms of what good is being accomplished. I guess you get God explaining afterwards. Now I know that you'll do whatever I say. Basically, you trust me perfectly. But that's as far as it takes you. That dilemma.
The fourth commandment, honor thy father and mother. Uh, the word honor there, that command to honor, seems like it'd be pretty close to something like,
Mhm.
what, be pious toward, or exhibit a
Yeah,
certain kind of piety
certain kind
toward
of
your
piety.
father and mother.
Yeah,
And that seems to be the human hook here in this dialogue. Again, the fact that Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father,
yeah,
and that Socrates' immediate reaction to that is a reaction involving this notion of piety.
yeah,
So piety goes beyond our relation to the gods,
yeah,
I guess, right?
yeah.
Um,
Although there's remarkably little about it pertaining to the human in the rest of the dialogue. Does that seem right to you? I mean, it starts out, that's the point of departure, right? Right. They never like quite come back to the question of whether this service towards the gods, or whatever you think piety is exactly, has implications for your service towards your parents, right? It starts out that is
yeah,
Socrates, or Euthyphro himself says early on, when Socrates asks him, what is piety? Euthyphro says, well, doing something like what I'm doing, right? Taking my father and prosecuting him for murder. Because he says something like, doesn't matter who it is that murders somebody else, right? Even if it's your father, right? The the unjust agent should be punished, and that's an act of piety, I guess. At least that's how I remember the dialogue there.
yeah. He says something interesting here. It seems to bring up the religion of the day early on, when Socrates exhibits surprise that Euthyphro is prosecuting his father. Euthyphro responds by saying, "It's ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think that it makes any difference whether the victim is a stranger or a relative.
Right.
One should only watch whether the killer acted justly or not. If he acted justly, let him go. But if not, one should prosecute. If that is to say the killer shares your hearth and table, the pollution is the same if you knowingly keep company with such a man and do not cleanse yourself and him by bringing him to justice. So he's saying there, the mere fact that, forget about the fact that this man is my father, he did something wrong by letting this slave die. And so the just thing to do is to prosecute. But then he invokes this matter of piety when he says, the pollution is the same if you
Yeah.
knowingly keep company with such a man and do not cleanse yourself in him. There's some kind of religious ritual almost involved in this notion.
Yeah. 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 I guess that's right. It's it's kind of funny too, right? That maybe it's just irony, I suppose, that on the one hand, you've got all these levels of piety coming up in sort of the dramatic background, insofar as Socrates is accused of impiety. Euthyphro claims what he's doing, and by punishing the wicked is a pious act because you acquire this ritual impurity of some sort, right? But there's an added level that the father whose act of omission or neglect of the slave that was tied up, his act was actually an act of going to the gods to find out what the gods want him to do about his murdering, drunken slave that he's tied up. Right. So the father is actually in the process of an act of piety, I guess you could say, right, when the death happens, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Plato's so attentive to bringing together those sorts of dramatic details and the content of the dialogue, this sort of intellectual inquiry into what piety is. How do you see the movement of that inquiry going?
Yeah.
So there are several attempts they make to articulate what piety is, and it doesn't seem as though any of them is finally quite sufficient.
Yeah.
So I don't know, in your seminar,
Yeah.
did you have some kind of sense of what
Yeah.
the order is there and
Yeah.
whether there is a kind of progress that's made?
Yeah, I think we finally came down on the side that there is a deep implicit progress, and I think that's really true, that there is a progress, even though the dialogue ends inconclusively, in part at least because Euthyphro decides to leave. He says, "I gotta run, Socrates," and Socrates is kind of begging him to stay. He says, "This is really important. Let's go all the way to the bottom if we can," and so in other words, Socrates is hopeful that progress could be made. But Euthyphro pulls back. In fact, there's an important point about 2/3 of the dialogue where Socrates is sort of cheering Euthyphro on, like he thinks Euthyphro is making real progress. And then Euthyphro seems to stop and to sort of refuse to answer any further questions. And Socrates says, "You were on the verge. You were on the verge of telling me," right? And you want to say, at least a reader is tempted to think Socrates sees what the truth is and needs Euthyphro to say it himself, to see it himself. But at least on the literal level, it looks like Socrates, you're about to make the final revelation that we could actually see what it is, and you pulled back, and Socrates pushes him a little bit more, and he refuses to go any further. So Socrates has to sort of reboot the conversation. But so aside from that's a sign that Socrates thought that there was a certain progress that was being made. It seems like but the basic progress seems like where you started, that it has something to do with justice, right? The first thing that Euthyphro says in answer to that question of what is piety is, well, it's when you prosecute the unjust person, right? The wrongdoer, right? And that's, I think, what Socrates sort of pushes him on, and then it sort of gets him to the point where it seems like there was problems with that. But then later on, when the conversation needs to be restarted, at least one of the points where it needs to be restarted, Socrates says, let's start with that again. Let's start with the idea of justice. And it seems like Euthyphro kind of sees better what it means for piety to be a kind of justice right then, because he suggests something along the lines of, yeah, that's what it is. It's a kind of justice, but a justice pertaining to just our conduct in relation to the gods, as opposed to justice in terms of our conduct in relation to humans. And Socrates says, yeah, now you're talking, right? That seems like that makes a lot of sense. So Socrates, despite his initial criticisms, seems to think there's something deeply right about saying it's a kind of justice. And maybe there's something deeply right about saying it has to do with justice in our actions in connection with the gods. And so they move that's at least like a level of progress, getting the general idea, the genus, if you will, of piety nailed down, and then trying to worry about its specific differences, right? Its particular attributes. I think that's an obvious kind of progress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's so interesting. The idea of the later part of the dialogue in some way returning to the earlier and capitalizing on it.
Yeah.
And it
Despite
seems
the initial criticism of it.
right. Yeah, so maybe something that's going on there is that there's this sense, however imperfect, that Euthyphro has and that Socrates agrees with, some sense regarding the truth of piety, some implicit connection it has with justice, and that Socrates wants to stay within that realm because, in some way, because that's where Euthyphro started.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to simply bring something in from the outside that's his own
He doesn't want to
clever
teach,
way of
right?
thinking about it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
He wants to discover together, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I think that passage near the end where he says, "Oh, you're about to tell me what it is exactly that the gods are up to." That's so important because it's as though Socrates mistrusts his own ability to see the truth unless it's in a conversation with somebody. Right? It's as though the communal aspect. I mean, this is getting kind of mystical, I suppose, but it's as though he's not sure he's understood something if someone else didn't understand it with him, right? It's as though he has hunches, but he's afraid to verbalize them unless someone else is all but thinking the same thing at the same time. I think I see that. I think I see that in several of the dialogues. The two students will sometimes think that's Socrates being cynical. Socrates has got it all figured out, and he's trying to lead someone by the hand to get him to say the right thing. I think Socrates he's so humble that he's not sure he sees the truth unless someone else kind of makes the same discovery with him. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
That's fascinating. That kind of thing is borne out in our classes.
Yeah.
It seems to me
Yeah.
that I see that in myself as a tutor, but also in other students that especially once they've made some progress, that if no one else in the room is seeing what you're saying, that's a red flag.
Yeah, it's a reason for doubt. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Which points to truth as a common good.
Yeah, something that's accessible to everybody, and if only you see it, that makes you wonder whether you really got the truth there.
Yeah. And it I guess thinking back to the notion of piety too, in the context of something like religious belief, it's maybe an indication of something wrong with our culture, that we tend to see religious belief as a matter primarily of something radically private and individualized. And you might happen to agree with others in terms of religious belief, but that there's nothing super important about that. And what the effect that has is divorcing the notion of religious belief from truth.
Yeah.
And it seems like a big part of what this dialogue is about is with the importance of seeing a connection between, what is the truth of piety? And what is the truth of one's religious belief? There's that fascinating scene. It's kind of early on, and it's almost, you might almost view it as a kind of aside, but it's where Euthyphro is saying, well, what piety is, Socrates, is what I am doing, prosecuting the wrongdoer, and I can verify that this is piety because we see the gods doing it.
Yeah, right.
They prosecute each other. They essentially attack each other.
They punish each other.
They punish each other. And he gives some of the examples, which are sort of horrifying examples. He brings up the fact that Zeus, who's the best of the gods, bound his own father because his own father unjustly swallowed his sons. And Socrates, in a somewhat uncharacteristic way, he sort of intervenes and says, Euthyphro, I'm actually a defendant in this legal case because I find it hard to accept things like that being said about the gods.
Yeah, right.
Almost as though, in the context of this dialogue, you wonder if Socrates is saying, to even say things about the gods could be a kind of impiety.
Yeah. Certainly say things like that, you mean? Is it, or do you mean
Yeah.
even talking about them?
No, I just meant these
things
sorts
like
of
that.
stories.
Yeah. Things where you're attributing grotesque or unjust actions to them, right? That should be a sign that you're being impious towards them, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could think of them, maybe not explicitly, but you could think of Socrates as partly trying to show unconsciously, maybe, what piety is to Euthyphro, right? Because these kinds of beliefs themselves are impious. I think even later on, Euthyphro will say, yeah, the gods don't, they all agree about punishing the wicked. And I think he even says, all good things come from the gods. Does that ring a bell? Something like that? I'm sure that Socrates says that at least, and I think Euthyphro agrees. So it's hard to imagine that even the Greek, the pantheon of Zeus and company, can be consistently, piously thought of as being doing things that are obviously cruel, right? Whether you're on team Zeus or team Kronos, right? One of them's doing something that's unjust, right? Whether it's Kronos by eating his sons, right, or Zeus by punishing Kronos, who was doing nothing that was unjust, right? So it seems like, well, I guess it's true that the polytheism in general is sort of the first criticism, one of the first criticisms that Socrates makes, that when you've got multiple gods, you've got the possibility of them disagreeing with each other about what justice is, right? And therefore that would imply what piety is, would be contingent on what God you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a real thing. It'd be just whatever Zeus wants. That's piety, or to do whatever Zeus wants is piety towards Zeus, but it might not be piety towards Kronos or something like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it forcefully but implicitly brings up the question, as you say, of polytheism
Yeah.
as truly questionable.
Yeah.
Socrates has tact enough, I think, not to raise that question point blank.
Yeah. Right.
Especially given his circumstances where he's being
He's about to
charged.
be tried. Yeah.
But you might say he's hopeful that Euthyphro would at some point start thinking about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whether this sort of view of the gods is one that ought to stand up.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a spot. I think this is the spot you were referring to earlier, where you were talking about how Euthyphro seems to get close to truth,
Yeah. Right.
but pulls back, and Socrates ends up, as you say, having to reboot the conversation. I'm trying to find it here, but I'm thinking about this section where Euthyphro, what's the right word here? He charges that the statements that Socrates has been putting forth are somehow problematic,
Yeah.
and that the reason they haven't been coming to a sure conclusion here is that the words they're saying run around in circles.
Yeah.
And so how can I, Euthyphro, be expected to follow this conversation or settle on a determinate position? Because Socrates, these words that we're using, these words that you've been throwing out there are just somehow unstable, and they're impossible to follow.
Yeah, it's the statue of Daedalus passage, right? Or I think there's two statues of Daedalus passages, but
I think that's right.
yeah, because the statues of Daedalus supposedly Daedalus was a sculptor, I think, and he made these statues that supposedly moved about on their own or something like that.
Correct.
And I think Euthyphro says your arguments are moving about without, and it's spinning me around as well, I guess. And Socrates says something like, yeah, one of my ancestors was Daedalus, and people have accused me of doing that before. But says, but it's really your own views, Euthyphro, that are making your mind spin a bit, I think. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So Euthyphro will say, for example, that the pious is what the gods want.
Yeah.
What they love.
Mm-hmm.
And back to your point with the polytheism, Socrates raises this objection. Well, certain gods love A and other gods love B. So there's contradiction among the gods as to what they love.
Yeah,
that's an example of one of Euthyphro's statements being impossible to
Yeah. With them.
ground,
Yeah.
right? To hold to,
Yeah.
right?
Because they conflict with themselves, right?
They
They're
conflict with
yeah.
themselves. The
Yeah.
statements conflict with
Yeah.
themselves. Yeah. So when Euthyphro charges the statements with being problematic,
Yeah.
what's going on there? He's refusing to see that there's something in himself that's deficient when it
Yeah.
comes to knowledge?
Yeah. That he hasn't really thought through what it is he's doing when he's saying he's committing himself to doing only pious actions, right? So, in other words, Socrates is probing Euthyphro so that Euthyphro can be maybe coherent in his own actions, I guess, right? And his own desires. There's something half-baked about his own ideas of piety, right? And Socrates is trying to get him to bake them the rest of the way, right? But he's showing them that there's a real problem here. And that itself is kind of progress, by the way. You asked earlier, right, whether Socrates, they make any progress in this dialogue. If nothing else, Euthyphro goes from being confident that he knows what piety is to being less confident, or at least revealing to himself, although maybe he doesn't admit it to himself, revealing to himself that he can't explain his own sense of piety in a coherent way, right? That's a kind of progress, to find out you're confused, right? If you didn't think you were confused to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something, again, that it really models much of what happens in the classroom,
Yeah.
right? When students are engaging in conversation with one another.
Yeah.
And you really hope to see these moments where for any of us, we're capable of recognizing, oh, I wasn't quite onto something
Yeah.
in a way that I thought I was.
Yeah.
But this is actually a good thing,
Yeah.
because at least that door is now closed to me,
Yeah.
and I can pursue these other paths to
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah. It's just the raw material for learning the truth, right? If you don't know that you're confused or ignorant about something, right, you can't. That bars off the possibility of learning, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
Discovering the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And Euthyphro initially comes out pretty strong as someone who's not disposed that way.
Yeah.
He says, "Oh, look, I know all sorts of stories about the gods, Socrates, and I could sit here and tell you many stories,
Yeah.
radically surprising stories
Yeah.
about the gods." And Socrates says,
That's
"We'll do
okay.
that some other time."
Right now we're talking about what piety is, pal.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he claims to have some kind of maybe esoteric knowledge about the gods and the divine. So he's one who knows, right? Not someone who needs to learn. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You almost wonder where Meno was going there, because he seemed to be wanting to tantalize Socrates with a different direction the dialogue could have gone in terms of these are the secret teachings about the gods or something like that. But Socrates says that's not the first thing we need to settle, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that brings to mind for me Augustine in the Confessions,
Yeah.
where he part of his deep criticism of the Manichees, with whom he spent 10 years, is that they're all about the kind of esoteric knowledge
Yeah.
regarding God and sin and
Yeah.
humanity. And it's crucial for Augustine that he come to a deeper and clearer intellectual sense of who and what God is.
Yeah.
The mere fact that God is one and that he's spiritual,
Yeah.
for Augustine, is something that takes him 10 years
Yeah.
to come to see.
To settle.
But when he does, it's an enormous contribution to
Yeah.
his own conversion.
Yeah.
And so in a funny way, although this dialogue is in no sense Christian,
Yeah. Right.
there's something about the path Socrates is pursuing that lines up with what you see Augustine doing in Confessions.
Yeah. Do you think this is right? You could sort of say that question I mentioned earlier about that we talked about in connection with Abraham, right? About whether the gods do certain things because those things, those acts, have a certain excellence called piety, or whether whatever it is the gods want us to do, whatever arbitrary thing they settle on us doing, that just is all that piety is, right? That question, which is it? Which is prior, the God's will, and that settles what the pious is, or the pious itself is prior even to the God's will? That's an important question. I think I said this earlier, but to go further, that's an important question for a believer, a Christian in particular, right? To have, right? Does God? Because you should be torn, it seems to me, about how to answer that question, right? You don't want to say there's something that stands over and above God called piety or virtue or excellence or goodness. that God is measured by, right? Because it seems like then God is not God, right? He's not the first thing, right? On the other hand, you also shouldn't want God to stand over what's good or virtuous or pious in such a way that his dictates render them such that there's nothing about the internal constitution of those actions that makes it choice-worthy on our part. It's just the divine imprimatur, the divine command, right? Do X, right? Whatever it is, whether it's sacrificing your son on the one hand or being kind to the poor on the other hand, right? And it seems like a Christian is forced to really chew on that question, and maybe also to see that at the end of the day, the answer has to somehow be that those two things, the divinity itself, God himself, can't be distinct from the good or the virtuous, right? It has to constitute God in some way. And Socrates is sort of on the way towards that view. I think he doesn't see it explicitly. He just sees it as a puzzle. Which is first, the pious or the God, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that there are different routes intellectually that one could take toward God, the question of who and what God is, does God exist, and what is he like?
Yeah.
But maybe one of those paths is via this kind of question.
Yeah.
That is to say, this is not just a question about what are the right sorts of religious practices or
Yeah.
duties or obligations,
Yeah.
but really who and what is God?
Yeah. Right.
In such a way that this kind of question could be resolved.
Yeah. Right.
Right? That only with the right conception of God is a human going to work his way out of this terrible conundrum regarding what I should do in the religious realm.
Yeah.
Should I simply wait for whatever capricious decision the gods come up with?
Yeah.
Or do I critically subject God or the gods to some more universal and abstract sense of goodness or excellence?
That I have. Yeah.
Neither of which seems like, as you say, a satisfactory way to go.
Right. Yeah, you think this is right too? You could even see if you've read the Republic and some of the other Platonic dialogues, that Socrates' own view about the gods has to be, I guess, at the end, that whatever is really divine is finally not distinct from the good itself, right? Or something that is something like a virtue, right? Like piety is a kind of virtue, maybe you could say, right? So you see in the first thing that I think he calls divine a few times in the Republic. Um, it's not a person, an anthropomorphic person, the way the Olympian gods are, right? In fact, it's hard to see that it's a person. All you can see is that it's somehow divine, right? And it's good. It's good through and through, right? It is goodness itself, and everything else is a imitation or a shadow of it. Using the image of the cave in the Republic. So that I kind of think, although you don't see it on the surface, I think the puzzle that Socrates is presenting to Euthyphro is something that he sees what the answer is finally, that you have to unify the divine and the good itself. So he's sort of going in the direction that the Christians go, right? And that Aristotle goes and other philosophers have gone.
Yeah.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of striking in that light that when you're aware of those heights that Socrates reaches in, say, the Republic, and in a different way, maybe in the Symposium, that none of that comes up here.
No.
And
which is especially funny because this is a dialogue that's supposed to have happened after those, right?
Yes.
So they're, at least if you think about Socrates as a character spread across, that's presented across several plays, if you will, right? It's supposed to be, he has these ideas from the Symposium in the Republic in his head already. This is right before he dies, right?
Yeah, so on the one hand, there's something almost crushing about that, or at the very least unsatisfying. But on the other hand, when we think about the fact that Socrates is talking with this particular person, Euthyphro, who is simply, he's not the kind of person for whom that sort of conversation could take place right here and now.
Yeah.
Not to mention that the circumstances don't seem to allow for it. But the fact that Socrates is, even in these urgent circumstances, willing to start from square one with Euthyphro.
Yeah.
and see how far they can get
Yeah.
is
Right.
really
Yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
As opposed to telling Euthyphro, look, just sit down. Let me tell you this big thing about
Yeah. Follow me on
divinity.
this, right? Just
Right.
walk him through the whole argument. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And he again, as you said, there Euthyphro is not just well, just cut to the chase. The Euthyphro is a person who's professionally interested in what piety is, right? So it's critical for Euthyphro as a priest or whatever he is to know what he's doing, right? To have a sense of these things, and so you can almost see it. Although Socrates portrays his interest in this question because he says, "I'm going to court for this very matter, so you got to help me out." I think it's probably also an act of concern for Euthyphro. Let me help you towards this, so you can be a better priest, right?
Yeah. There's a great line where that early scene where Socrates is reacting strongly to Euthyphro's beliefs and stories about the
Yeah,
gods. And Socrates says, I find it very hard
yeah,
to
I
accept
doubt
those
these. Yeah,
stories.
yeah,
At the end of that passage, Socrates says, what are we to say, we who agree that we ourselves have no knowledge of the gods?
mm,
Tell me, by the God of friendship, do you really
yeah.
believe these
By
things are
the
true?
God, yeah, yeah,
And that's so interesting because it confirms what you said, that Socrates wants to present himself to Euthyphro as a friend,
yeah,
as one really concerned about him. But he's also signaling it's truer to connect friendship with
yeah,
divinity than to
yeah,
connect uh, cannibalism or castration
yeah.
or
Gosh,
murder or any of
yeah,
these
yeah.
bizarre things with
Right.
divinity.
That you see in the Olympian gods. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I think that's right, and that's why I think it's kind of striking towards the end of the dialogue where Socrates he seems to be the part of the dialogue seems to become an act of piety in a way because he's after he's gotten Euthyphro seems to see that piety is a kind of justice, a justice that specifically deals with the care of the gods, and then Euthyphro specifies it's a care of the gods that a slave uh, the slave that the kind of exercise or practice or service that a slave does for his master when his master is about going about something else. At that point, that's when Socrates tries to probe him and say, "Okay, what is it the gods are up to?" And that's when Euthyphro sort of puts the brakes on. He says, "Well, they're doing many fine things, right? Fine and noble things." And Socrates says, "Yeah, like what? Can you explain that?" And Euthyphro doesn't seem to want to say anything more. And that's when Socrates says, "You were about to really blow the lid off this," right? And you stopped short. But right after that, Socrates says, everything that we have that's good seems to come from the gods. And the gods, whatever they're up to, it can't be for their own benefit because you, Euthyphro, have already admitted that the gods are good, right? They have all that is good, right? Which is itself a big admission, right? And hard to square with the Olympian gods.
Yeah.
But Socrates is saying, what could they be possibly, who could the gods be trying to serve or help by their actions, whatever those actions are? And Euthyphro won't say. I think Socrates suspects it has to be us somehow, right? If the gods can't benefit by whatever it is that they're up to, right? What's left, right? Humanity or the universe, maybe you could say in some way. And that itself is a kind of a wondrous thing to think about, that the gods who need nothing, right, are the source of all that is good, and they are concerning themselves, right, with making our lives good in some way, right?
Yeah.
Seems like Socrates is on the verge of sort of seeing that or saying that. And just thinking of that thought, assuming it's true, right, or plausible at least, is itself a pious thing, I think, right, to
Mm.
dwell on that, right, the generosity, if you will, of the divine,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, and it's so interesting that seems to be precisely where Euthyphro can't go for some reason.
For some reason, yeah.
And it's hard to know why, but it seems connected with the fact that he views himself as an expert in the divine,
Yeah.
and precisely as such holds to this sort of separate individualistic form of knowledge
Yeah.
that he may or may not share
Mm-hmm.
with you.
Yeah, maybe.
That seems connected with a view of the gods that is more detached and not concerned with us necessarily.
Yeah, maybe that's right. Yeah. In other words, it leans more towards the idea of the gods or the idea of piety, that just we do whatever the gods want, right? And who knows what the good of it is, right? And maybe there is no God other than it's pleasing the whims of the gods at that moment.
So that could be why might one seek to become an expert in the realm of the divine if that's your view? Well, because it gives you power,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
To the extent that the gods are this way, they're essentially power brokers.
Yeah.
One who's expert in the divine could also become powerful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we didn't mention it, but yeah, there's one point in which the way Euthyphro is describing what the care of the gods looks like is, well, we give the gods sacrifices, we slay a pig or something, right? And then the gods answer our prayers, right? And so Socrates says, so it's a kind of commerce. Is that what piety is, right? You're making an exchange with the gods. You buy them off with the smell of a burnt pig, and the gods say, "Okay, tell you what, I'll let you win this battle against Syracuse or something like that."
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of the priest there becomes a power broker even between you and the gods, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So the realm of the divine or the religious, the pious, is kind of it's a set of techniques maybe
Yeah.
that through which you're able to exercise a kind of control over the
Yeah.
gods,
Yeah.
and therefore over other men and
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah, and to get back to something you were saying, it sort of gets away from the idea of a shared good that you and the gods are up to. It's just more sort of that you, Euthyphro, are looking at the gods. Okay, they like the smell of burnt pig for some reason, right? So I'll give them some of that, right? And I can't relate to that, right? Well, I guess everyone likes the smell of bacon, but other than that, I have no interest in slaying pigs, right? But for some reason, Zeus likes that, and I would sure like to beat Syracuse in a battle, right? So I've got my good, he's got his goods, and we just sort of exchange, right? That's like the commerce image that I think is so striking, and Socrates puts it before Euthyphro. Is that what you're saying? And Euthyphro he finds it distasteful. He says something like, if you want, you can call it commerce, I guess, or a trade. Is it? But to make our relationship with the gods transactional that way, right? Makes it sound like you get some good out of it and I get some good out of it, and we don't share a good, right? There's not something we share.
Yeah. Okay, so that's toward the end.
Yeah.
And of course Euthyphro does run off, like you said.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it could be that part of that has to do with the fact that he's been made uncomfortable
Yeah.
regarding his own profession.
Yeah. Right.
And to stay might increase that discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah. Pricks his conscience in a way. Yeah.
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 Seems like it could.
Yeah.
Well, how are we doing time?
I think we should, call it.
Okay. All right.
All right. Thanks,
Chris.
John. Yeah.
That's great.
That was fun.